One of the most satisfying parts of protein purification is seeing that nice crisp band on an SDS page gel telling you that yes, you did purify your protein of interest and it's nice and pure. One of the most relieving parts of protein purification is sticking that nice pure protein in the -80 freezer, where you know that now it's going to be safe for longer term storage. And one of the most fun parts of protein purification comes right before that with the actual freezing of your protein. Because instead of actually freezing it, you are trying to vitrify it and prevent there from being ice crystals forming that would kind of break up your protein. And the way that you're going to do this vitrification is through flash freezing by sticking it in liquid nitrogen. And so when you stick it in liquid nitrogen, basically the molecules run out of energy to wiggle really, really fast. And they're not able to kind of hook up into the networks that they need to get into in order to crystallize. So when we talk about freezing, we typically mean that the molecules are kind of crystallizing. So if you think about water, all of the water molecules are forming these ice crystals where they're all oriented in the same way and they're making the maximum amount of bonds to one another. And so it expands when ice freezes. There's water flowing throughout the channels of a protein. And so the water in those channels throughout the protein, if it freezes, then it's going to expand and your protein is going to crack. Add some sort of antifreeze to liquid in your pipes in order to prevent the pipes from bursting when water freezes within them. We can add glycerol to prevent the water from freezing within our protein. And so the glycerol is going to serve as a cryoprotectant, a sort of antifreeze that's going to make it harder for those water molecules to find one another, hook up in that network that would form that ice, those crystals that would then pop open our protein and make it kind of hurt. We don't want our protein to hurt, and so we add the glycerol and then we freeze it really, really fast. So we've got those two ways that we're kind of preventing the ice formation. We add the glycerol, the cryoprotectant, and we freeze it really, really fast. So something like 10% glycerol depends on your protein. And you can add that after the fact, like after you purify it, then add glycerol. Or what you could do is you could actually include glycerol in, say, your size exclusion buffer or your desalting buffer. But note that it's going to then increase the pressure, and so you're going to have to lower the flow rate. So that's easy though. You kind of just add glycerol to that, and then your protein is going to come out with the glycerol already in it, and you don't have to worry about changing the concentration. But you can calculate the concentrations and things. You can make a glycerol solution of like 80% glycerol. You can even make it in the buffer that you want your protein to be in, so you're not changing the buffer concentrations, you're just changing the glycerol. And that way you can kind of, after the fact, after you purify it, then add the glycerol to that. And just note the kind of concentration changes and all of those sorts of things. But with the glycerol, that is going to also slow down the water molecules, make it so they can't hook up to one another, form those ice crystals that would cause your protein to crack open. Now, some proteins, enzymes especially, you often do more of the glycerol. So sometimes you might see when you buy an enzyme, it comes with a bunch of glycerol in it. Some proteins don't need glycerol, some proteins need more, some need less, and so you might need to kind of play around to see what your protein needs, see if it's stable, if it has activity before and after, all of these various things. So there's a lot of kind of optimizing that goes into freezing your protein the first time around and finding conditions for purifying it and storing it the first time around. But once you figure that out, then hopefully now you've got a system in place and the future times should be a lot easier. You want to avoid having to freeze thaw your protein too many times. So it doesn't like being woken up a lot, and so I think that most of you can probably relate to that. And so instead of like freezing thawing every time you want to use some of your protein, you make aliquots before you freeze them. And so single use portions, and so your single use might be different for different proteins. And so if it's something like an enzyme where you're only needing tiny little amounts at a time, well then what you can do is you can actually aliquot it in PCR strips. And so you can use a repeater pipette if you have one of those to make little aliquots, and then you only need to take one of those little PCR tubes each time that you want your protein. And so you can just freeze it directly in those tubes, and then you can, on the box lid, put how much is in them, what's in them, and then just make a marking on the top of the lids. You can just take a Sharpie and just go along the top of the lids. When you're doing this kind of aliquoting, you want to be doing it on ice or in the cold room. And it's helpful if you've got one of those kind of like metal blocks that you can stick onto your ice tray, or that comes off and it stays cold. And that way you're able to more easily kind of pipette into all of these different tubes. You can also make a custom piece of plastic with holes in it that you can then use, because if you have a bunch of tubes just scattered around in your ice, it can be really hard to see which tubes are where and which you put solution in already. Note too, though, that when you are freezing something or vitrifying it, whatever you're doing, you're going to lose some of the sample along the walls of the container. And so if you've got smaller tubes, you're gonna actually lose a large proportion of what you put in there. But if you have a bigger amount of liquid, then it's kind of more of a drop in the bucket. So these are just things that you need to keep in consideration when you say, okay, I'm putting 50 microliters in there. Well, when you go to take it out, you might have a little less than that you're actually able to recover from there. But you make these aliquots, you freeze the aliquots, you stick them in the -80, and you're good to go. Now, sometimes it doesn't make sense to make those tiny little aliquots for your purposes. And so if you know that you're going to need a large portion of protein each time you go to use it, then make bigger aliquots, maybe in something like Eppendorf tubes, microcentrifuge tubes. Also, it doesn't make sense if you know that you need these little aliquots, but you have oodles and oodles of volume. And so if you got like 15 mils of your protein solution and you want to make like 25 microliter aliquots, that would be an insane amount of tubes. So instead, what you can do is kind of just do some strips, do like whatever's manageable for you in terms of strips, freeze those strips, and then save the rest in kind of bigger aliquots. And then when you run out of the little tubes, then you go and take one of the bigger tubes and you can go and aliquot that out. And that way you're only kind of having to freeze thaw it one additional time. And so it's all about thinking strategically and thinking ahead. You always want to be thinking ahead. What am I doing this for? What am I going to need this for? What volumes am I going to need with this? And then you can kind of figure out a strategy for your storage. A storage tip too is that if you have them in the strips, what you can do is stick the strips in a freezer box. So like one of those cardboard freezer boxes. It's good if you have one with like the holes at the bottom. But if you don't, it's okay. The liquid nitrogen will evaporate off. Take the dividers out of there, put the strips in there, put it in a styrofoam container, and pour the liquid nitrogen on top of it. That'll freeze the strips where they are. You just pull it out. If you've got one with holes, the liquid nitrogen is just gonna go through the holes. Now you got your frozen samples. Toss the lid on, toss it in the -80, and toss back and relax.